So today we are on day 6 of the book Meditations for Mortals. And this chapter is titled, You Can't Care About Everything. The art of being wise is the art of knowing what to overlook. William James. In his memoirs, the late French philosopher Raymond Aron recounts a story in which he is strolling through Paris with his wife, Suzanne, and their newborn daughter, one glorious morning in the 1930s. It's easy to picture the scene, the whole city soaking up the sun, making conversation in the shade of trees, or drinking coffee at pavement bistros. Moving through the city, they suddenly spot one of their friends, Simone Weil, seemingly convulsed with grief. The Arons ask, "What's wrong?" "There's a strike in Shanghai," Weil responds, eyes brimming with tears, "and troops fired on the workers." Weil, as the scholar Alan Sepoy explains, was one of those people who never manage to abstract themselves from the torrent of suffering in which humanity finds itself engulfed. It's not for me to say that Weil was wrong to feel such distress about a horror unfolding thousands of miles away, to which she had no personal connection. Some level of concern for the suffering of distant others is plainly laudable. And to many of her admirers today, the Jewish Catholic Marxist mystic is regarded as a saint. But I'm on safer ground asserting that most of us, including me, would be entirely unable to function were we to experience the emotional impact of every killing or act of injustice around the world as if it had befallen a loved one. And yet, that isn't too far from what's increasingly demanded of us today. Maybe this seems like a strange claim to make about an era that's more often characterized as profoundly self-centered and heartless. Thanks to digital technology, though, it's also a time in which, assuming you're the kind of person who considers it your duty to care about anything beyond the walls of your home, you're liable to be asked to care with maximum intensity about everything. Partly, that's simply because we are more connected than ever, so that anyone scrolling a social media platform can be instantaneously invited to care about more human suffering than the greatest saints in history would have encountered over the course of their entire lives. But it's also specifically a consequence of the online attention economy, in which the truly valuable commodity, the thing from which advertisers and social media firms and many news organizations stand to make their money, is not the news itself, it's your attention. By now, we understand that this arrangement boosts the prominence of pointless celebrity feuds, polarizing conspiracy theories, and videos of people humiliating themselves in public. It hardly matters whether or not a story is important, so long as it's compelling. What's less obvious is how the same dynamic puts pressure on even the most honorable media organizations and activist groups to exaggerate the importance of every story or cause, because each of them is effectively locked with every other in an arms race for your attention. The result is that even when some event in the news is legitimately extremely serious, you can be sure it'll be presented as even worse than that, except in those corners of the internet where there are more clicks to be gained by just as misleadingly denying its existence altogether. It was in 2016, after the election of Donald Trump and the Brexit referendum result, that I first began to notice a bizarre effect of all of this in myself, and more acutely in certain friends and acquaintances. It wasn't simply that people were addicted to doom scrolling, although they certainly were. It was that they'd started living inside the news. The news had become the psychological center of gravity in their lives, more real somehow than the world of their home, their friends, their careers, to which they dropped in only sporadically before returning to the main event. They seemed significantly more personally involved in whether Trump would fire his Secretary of State or who he might nominate for the Supreme Court than in any of the local or personal dramas unfolding in their workplaces or families or neighborhoods. Their motives were generally good. So it seems a little rude to point out that this behavior in no way makes the world a better place. Living inside the news feels like you're doing your duty of being a good citizen. But you can stay informed on 10 minutes a day. Scrolling any more than that risks becoming disempowering and paralyzing, and certainly eats up time you could have spent making a difference. The Canadian writer David Kane envisions a different way of doing things. Imagine if all the available public concern for a given issue could be collected in a huge rain barrel and then redistributed among fewer people. So, for example, instead of having 50 million people care about an issue for 6 hours, we could distill that 300 million hours, so that's 50 million people into 6 hours, 300 million hours, of public concern into, say, 3,000 people who made it their primary moral concern for a decade. We can't reallocate public concern like rain barrel water, but maybe each of us, within ourselves, can become a little more focused. Imagine if it was normal for each person to focus 10 minutes on one or two issues at a time, rather than taking on the emotional burden of dozens and dozens of issues and feeling helpless about the state of the world. I just want to step aside from the reading and say that this is reminding me of a time when I was a teenager and somehow I would listen to a lot of BBC News those days. In fact, at some point people even said you seem to have a slightly BBC accent. Maybe I heard too much of BBC News. But what I remember was that every day they would share all these different things that are going on in the world. There are wars happening, there are genocides happening, there is environmental destruction happening. And it would leave me feeling so bereft that, oh my goodness, like there's such a lot going on in the world. And not that I was doing anything about it. I just felt, okay, I'm very informed, I know all that's going on in the world. But I felt pretty helpless about doing anything. I just felt that, okay, I'm just born in a bad time, you know. So this is what it's reminding me of. And what he's saying here is, instead of being concerned about many, many, many things, how about you take a few things and you actually set aside 10 minutes of your day focusing on that and asking yourself what you can do about it. Makes a lot of sense. So let's get back to the reading. In other words, pick your battles and don't feel bad about doing so. By embracing your limitations in this way, you'll be in a position to do more to fight the battles that you do pick, and also thereby to feel better about yourself than the person who tries to care about everything, who may be largely focused, in any case, on trying to show that he or she cares about everything. My favorite example here concerns a former sneaker firm executive and dedicated Trump opponent named Eric Hageman, profiled in the New York Times in 2018, where he was presented as a kind of anti-Simone Weil. Instead of trying to absorb the whole world's pain, he had opted to live as if the upheavals in American public life weren't happening at all. So he consumed no news whatsoever. And when he left his home in rural Ohio to get coffee and scone from his local cafe, he wore headphones playing white noise, so he couldn't hear fellow customers talking about politics. Unsurprisingly, conservative news outlets condemned him as a whining liberal, while progressive ones labeled him as a monster of privilege. One journalist disparaged Hageman as the most selfish person in America, and further fumed, not everyone gets to be ignorant. People whose families are being torn apart by US immigration policy don't get to be ignorant. People affected by gun violence don't get to be ignorant. And yet, might Hageman simply have accurately assessed his capacity for care and then decided to apportion it more effectively than most of us do? In his downtime, the Times explained, he was busy restoring an area of wetlands that he'd purchased. When he was finished, he planned to preserve it for public access. He predicted the project would require most of his savings. There are more selfish ways to spend a life. It used to be said about certain horrifying news events that if you're not outraged, you're not paying attention. But that's a relic of a time when people had attention to spare, and when it wasn't in the vested interests of media outlets to stroke as much outrage as possible. In an age of attention scarcity, the greatest act of good citizenship may be learning to withdraw your attention from everything except the battles that you've chosen to fight. So that's the chapter for today. And it's about deciding what you want to focus on instead of being told to care about everything. What do you genuinely care about? What do you actually care about? And like this wonderful example of Eric Hageman, who wasn't really interested in the news, but he did a little bit. He was restoring the local wetland that he'd purchased, and he was preparing it for public access. And some people might say that, oh, he's privileged. He doesn't have to listen to the news. He's privileged. But on the other hand, maybe he's more accurately assessing his capacity to care. Can you and I also more accurately assess what we can care about and what we can do about the things we care, and in that way give our attention to those things? This is the message from today's reading. And I feel there's a lot here to reflect on. Wonderful. Thank you.